My name is Tom Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Faith Inclusion Network and have the honor of serving on the Core Council for ITD. And on this day of Juneteenth, we have the great opportunity of using this as an opportunity to discuss race and disability. And we're very honored to have Reverend Dr. Lamar Hardwick to lead us in that discussion. I first met Lamar on Facebook. Years ago, he put on Facebook a call for stories about people with disability and their experience with church leadership. And I saw that on Facebook. I said, sure, I'll share mine. Well, I never did realize it until a few months later. He contacted me and wanted to include that in his book, Church and Disability. And so since then, I've come to know Lamar a lot better. He's an African-American pastor, clergyman from Atlanta who was identified with Asperger's or high-functioning autism in his 30s. Dr. Hardwick has written Epic Church, 5 Steps to Becoming the Church Jesus is Building. He's written The Life and Journey of an Autistic Pastor. And then he's also written Disability in the Church, a Vision for Diversity and Inclusion. And his most recent book, which he'll be talking about today, is How Ableism Fuels Racism, Dismantling the Hierarchy of Bodies in the Church. Through all of his speaking and his books, he's been known as the autism pastor, and he's positioned in a very unique way and qualified to speak on those things. Since I've gotten to know Lamar, he's bright and insightful. He's an amazing man of faith, a theologian, author, disability advocate, and family man. He's a man of courage as he copes with disability and cancer. But Lamar does not let that limit him. He's uniquely positioned now to talk about the intersection of race and disability. So today we're very honored, and help me to welcome the Reverend Dr. Lamar Hardwick.
Thank you and good morning. I am, as Tom has said, a recently retired pastor. Most of you all know I'm in year 4 of battling stage 4 cancer. And so at the end of 2023, I semi-retired, at least as a pastor. But I share that to say that I'm a storyteller at heart. And so I'm going to tell some stories and share with you about how ableism fuels racism. I see a few people who have probably heard these stories before. I know Dr. Lee's probably heard some of these stories, Tom. So just laugh like it's the first time you heard them. There's a story of a woman who, unfortunately, she falls ill and she ends up passing away, and she goes to heaven. And she goes to the gate, and Peter's at the gate. Now, I don't know why Peter's always at the gate. Every heaven story you've ever heard, Peter's at the gate, right? And so she goes to the gate, and she sees her family and friends waving her on, and she asks Peter, how do I get into this place? And Peter says, oh, it's easy. All you have to do is spell one little word. And she says, well, what's the word? He says, love. She says, oh, that's easy, L-O-V-E. He says, welcome to heaven, enjoy your family and friends, enjoy Jesus for eternity. Well, a couple of years pass by, and she's walking around, and she runs into Peter, and he looks very frantic. And he grabs her and says, hey, I need your help. The Lord really has me busy today. Can you watch the gate? And she says, well, sure. He says, now remember, if anyone shows up at the gate, have them spell the word. And she says, no problem. Well, she's standing at the gate, and after about an hour, her husband shows up. Yes, some of you know this is not going to go well. And so she's like, oh my God, I'm glad to see you. It's so good to see you. He sees his family and friends waving him in. It's so good to see you. She said, before I let you in, tell me what happened on earth after I died. He says, well, you're not going to like this, but about 6 months after you died, you know how your sister and you look alike? Well, I really missed you, and so I ended up marrying your sister. And she just leans back and says, oh, really? She says, well, what else happened after I died? He says, you're not going to like this either, but 6 months after I married your sister, we played the lottery and we won $150 million. And she just rubs her chin and says, oh, really? He says, enough about me. How do I get into this place? She says, oh, it's simple. All you have to do is spell one little word. And he says, well, what's the word? And she says, Czechoslovakia. Now, I share that story about heaven not as a theological entryway, but more as a cultural entryway. Because even in the culture, heaven is sort of looked at as the ideal. We use it as an adjective. This vacation was heavenly. Look at how heavenly the water is and how blue it is, or this ice cream is heavenly. We use it sort of to describe what we have come to know or feel as the ideal. And so the question that I posed in this research project, which eventually turned into a book, is who are the gatekeepers to what is ideal? Now, I've lived in the Atlanta area for over 2 decades, and Georgia is where I settled after college. It's where I married my wife. It's where our children were born, and Georgia really is the only place that I've known in my adult employment life. And with all this that the state means to me, I am still acutely aware that Georgia is still part of the South. And the South still has its fair share of challenges regarding racial bias. On February 23rd, 2020, approximately 1 p.m., 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery was shot and killed while jogging in a suburban neighborhood just 15 minutes outside of downtown Brunswick. And the 2 men who shot him were a father and son, Gregory and Travis McMichael. Now, like many people, I first heard of the murder of Ahmaud. It wasn't that February when he lost his life. And the distance between where I live in Brunswick is not so far that I would have missed the news story about a young man being gunned down. But the reason I didn't hear about what happened to Ahmaud is because it didn't make the news at all. At least not when he was first killed. It wasn't until May, until after a cell phone video of the shooting surfaced, that the country found out about this senseless killing. Now, the local prosecutor had initially declined to indict the 2 men who shot him, and without video evidence that clearly shows the McMichaels accosting Ahmaud without provocation, they likely would have not faced criminal charges at all. At the time, Governor Brian Kemp made this statement about the senseless killing. Ahmaud was a victim of a vigilante style of violence that has no place in Georgia, because some tried to justify the actions of his killers by claiming they had protection of an antiquated law that is ripe for abuse. Now, Kemp would later sign a hate crime bill after Georgia drew criticism for being one of the 4 states that didn't have a law against such crimes. And that law allows judges to impose sentences to increase punishment against those who target victims based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, sexuality, or sexual orientation, gender, mental disability, and physical disability. Now, Ahmaud didn't have a weapon, yet his actions were deemed so aggressive and dangerous enough for law enforcement to accept the McMichaels' account that they had acted in self-defense. But when the truth came to light, the McMichaels and the man who took the cell phone footage were eventually all found guilty of murder and of committing a hate crime. In August of 2019, in Aurora, Colorado, 23-year-old Elijah McClain, after receiving a 911 call, was approached by police because the caller reported a, quote, suspicious person walking down the road with a ski mask who was behaving strangely. Now, when officers confronted McClain, he repeatedly asked the officers to let him go, and he announced that he was going home. Now, officers at the scene eventually restrained McClain, who only weighed 143 pounds, using a chokehold, and when paramedics arrived, an injection of ketamine was administered to calm him down. Because of the strength he used to resist the officers, they wrongly suspected McLean was on drugs at the time of the encounter. Now, most of you all know this. Ketamine is a powerful sedative, and the paramedics administered to Elijah a dose that was nearly twice the amount recommended for an individual his size. And shortly after, Elijah stopped breathing. Then they took him to the hospital where he would die 3 days later. He had no weapon, and his family reported that Elijah suffered from anemia, which made him cold constantly, so it was not uncommon for him to wear warm clothes in warm seasons. Now, the impact of racial bias strongly shapes the treatment of people of color in the U.S. judicial system. According to the New York Civil Liberties Union, the NYPD from 2002 to 2011 conducted stop and frisk procedures on millions of citizens, and about 90% of those being Black and Hispanic people. 88% of those minorities who the police profiled and stopped had no weapons or contraband. Now, there are several research studies that have found that compared to white people, Black people are more often subject to automatic and subconscious negative stereotypes and prejudice. And these thoughts usually extend beyond just negative attitudes. Black and brown bodies are associated with violence, threatening behavior, and crime. And Black men are also more likely to be misremembered for carrying a weapon because of this bias. But let's be honest. These stories I'm sharing with you are not new. There's nothing new about the statistics that prove racial bias is a reality in our country. There's nothing new about Black authors and scholars and activists and clergy speaking up about these issues. What is new, and what I'm aiming to bring to this ongoing discussion, is that racial bias in America is not simply an issue of race. It is not simply an issue of skin preference. It is not just an issue of lack of diversity. Race-based slavery and the enduring racial bias and discrimination it created are about disability discrimination as well. Our issues with racism are, in fact, issues of ableism. And American Christianity has played a significant role in influencing ableism in our present culture and context. Now, there's one underlying factor, or one main one, that I talk about in my book and my research, and that is interpretation. It is interpreting behaviors of Black bodies as dangerous. And that is actually, believe it or not, rooted in ableism. Now, before we continue, I want to just define ableism as how I define it. And I define it as the practice of discriminating against people with disabilities based on the belief that normal, quote unquote, normal bodies are superior to those that are not. Essentially, it's a hierarchy of bodies. And we see ableism or body hierarchy working its way very silently through religion. Our rites, our rituals, and even our rhetoric often reflect the ways that ableism has infiltrated religion, especially in Western churches. Now, ableism also perpetuates the view that disabled bodies need repair or supervision. It assumes incompetence, regardless of the type or scope of disability. And ableism is the ranking of bodies, but it's not merely the ranking of bodies which matter the most. It is also ranking the bodies with the intention of holding the power to interpret the behavior and intentions of bodies deemed deficient or disabled. The ableism assumes the power to define which bodies are best and which behaviors are normal and dangerous. Now, this means that Black bodies are often targets of ableist ideology, an ideology that creates images of normal and ideal bodies that neither Black nor disabled bodies can ever achieve. The question is, how does this happen? So there are three major themes that connect ableism, racism, and religion that I found in my research and that I share in the book. And the first is what religion would label as initial sin. I'm careful to call it initial sin, not just because I'm a preacher and I want a good alliteration with eyes, but also because if you read my research in my book, I talk about how original sin in a lot of ways is unhelpful for this discussion. So the first is Initial sin. The theft of African bodies that supplied the transatlantic slave trade was an egregious sin of America, but it's not the only sin. And I dare to say it's not the sin. The sin that goes unaddressed in the history of America is the sin of ableism, or the ranking of bodies. And this is the sin that gives birth to racial bias. Second, there is the creation of idols and images. Now, American Christianity has often failed to hold the captors of African bodies accountable and has honored those responsible for the sin of slavery and racial discrimination. If you live in the South, then you know what I mean. It's the erection of monuments and the retelling of a history that led to a sense of exceptionalism or the creation of large egos. And the problem is that excessive exceptions lead to a sense of entitlement and exceptionalism. And egos that cast images and create idols serve as an anchor for societal norms. Images and idols are common in ableist ideology. In order to determine which bodies are best, we create images and place idols in our homes and communities. And the challenge in dealing with racial bias is understanding that racism cannot exist without ableism. Disability discrimination is at the heart of racial discrimination because the actual business of slavery is the business of bodies. There are bodies to be bred, bodies to sell, bodies to work, and unfortunately, bodies to worship. Black Africans were perceived as inherently disabled, which white slave owners used to justify enslaving them. And as a result, large swaths of American culture erected images of quote-unquote normal bodies, which have become objects of worship and admiration. So I want to say this very carefully and poignantly. The undoing of racism requires the destruction of ableist idols. And finally, the third thing that we discovered in the research is there's a creation of institutions. Those institutions serve the images and the idols of normalcy. So we steep American Christianity in the practice of treating sameness as sacred. And we build institutions around this practice. So bodies that are different are invited to lead, and the work that they produce is often deemed as deficient. Divides about religious issues are just one of the many ways that disability discrimination manifests itself in American Christianity. Because it's not just about right belief, it's about the right bodies being the only legitimate source for producing right beliefs. So initial sin, images and idols and institutions, these are what I call the big three of American racial bias, and it all begins with theft. The transatlantic slave trade was in fact the intentional ranking of bodies, and it served as a foundation for deciding which bodies are best, which bodies are most beautiful, how bodies are to behave, and where certain bodies belong, and which bodies of work are most credible. And built-in biases are at the core of how Western Christianity has formed and practiced in its earliest stages. And this is how ableism has shaped the church and shaped race in America. So European colonization from its inception has always been heavily shaped by disability. Even before the first ships arrived on the shores of the New World, beliefs about which bodies are most desirable influenced decisions about those deemed worthy enough to make the trip across the Atlantic. Able-bodiedness was a prerequisite to prosperity in the New World. And as a result, colonialism designed nearly every American system with the intention of exploiting or erasing disability. Enslaved Africans were most affected by this ideology, and they would carry them across the Atlantic in chains to fulfill the European dream of acquiring wealth and power. As early as 1636, we start to see definitions of disability shaped by this Puritan social order of family and farming. So initially, settlers established that the colony would help maintain the standard of living for any male citizen who became unable to work because of a disabling injury that occurred during active duty in the military. And in 1641, however, a more robust policy surfaced that gave a more definitive understanding of how the Puritans and their religious convictions shaped their ideas of disability. Now, the rhetoric born out of the early Puritan theology also served as a foundation for the creation of racial slavery. In 1619, when Africans arrived on the shores of North America, and by the mid-1600s, racial slavery was embedded in the colonial social, economic, and legal framework. And as early as 1640, disability weaved its way into the narrative of the newly forming nation. And racial slavery in the West began by using disability to make chattel slavery a matter of charity rather than a matter of equality. Defining Africans as mentally inferior or effectively disabled allowed for pro-slavery advocates to appeal to the Christian ethos of benevolence. And one example of how religious language was used to shape ideas about disability was the release of George Fitzhugh's now infamous defense of slavery, Cannibals All or Slave Without Masters. And in it, he argues that slavery was in fact humane when considered against the free labor system of the North. And Fitzhugh paved the way for developing the use of disability to define blackness and to further raise political and social support for racial slavery. And his work helped popularize what would come to be known as the popular or the positive good argument, rather. Pro-slavery thought has long had a complicated trajectory in the United States, and we can see this in its attempts throughout history to use religious rhetoric and economic and political arguments for the necessity of slavery. In fact, in the decade prior to the Civil War, the national pro-slavery arguments absorbed the ideology of the pro-slavery arguments emerging from the South. And as the 1830s ended, the positive good thesis grew in popularity thanks to Senator John C. Calhoun, who preached the message that racial slavery was an act of benevolence. And his arguments drew on existing religious, economic, and political arguments. And he expanded them to create a view of racial slavery that centered its practice on the kindness and charity of the slaveholder. Now, like Calhoun's argument, Fitzhugh's also had an ableist undercurrent. It used disability to argue for an ethical view of racial slavery in the United States, and in doing so, it created a rationale that connected able-bodiedness to labor and implied that the enslaved were content because despite their disability, they were cared for by their slaveholders. See, using disability imagery as something undesirable became central to the rhetoric of the positive good ideology because it centralized charity, pity, shame, and even distrust of abolitionists as ethical, moral, and religious issues, obliging the nation to embrace slavery, not merely as an institution, but as a conviction driven by a sense of religious duty. Now, the consequences of creating idols always extends beyond its immediate intention. And America has used religion to cover the tracks of its initial sin, only to watch the idols, images, and superficial ideals about Black and disabled bodies growing into an entire system that attached itself to its own religious practices. Images of beauty and notions about which humans have the best bodies is an egregious sin that has seduced the church and impacted the practice of the Western Christian faith. We too are recipients of the consequences of the theft of African bodies, namely the ableism and racism that have taught our tribe to worship false images that actually alienate people. Now, the influence of desire and attractiveness in contemporary culture is known as desirability politics. Desirability politics suggests that the social ideas of beauty and attractiveness shape systems of power and control, and quite often lead to intentional or unintentional oppression. The closer one is to being found desirable by social standards, the more access they have to resources, power, and privileges that make their life easier. Conversely, the further away a person is from being considered attractive and desirable by society, the further away they become from access to resources and opportunities to better their lives. Desirability and attractiveness are always not merely about physical appearance, but more often than not, they significantly shape how we are taught to treat people. And these are the images and the idols that we erect. Disability, skin color, gender, sexual identity, weight, education, and even nationality are all factors that determines a person's desirability. Unfortunately, this system is often used as a framework for the practice of evangelical faith. And it stands as a stark contrast to the framework that moves disability and racial inclusion from being possible to being a priority. The politics of desire and ability is a dangerous collection of ideals that taint religion, politics, and education and healthcare, and in doing so, create images and idols that we have been taught to worship. Early on, the Christian faith in America presented an ideal body type that served as a standard for health and well-being. And these concepts of what it meant to be healthy were rooted in racial and disability discrimination. Eventually, these views even led to the development of healthcare as a strategy for maintaining white supremacy in the aftermath of the Civil War. And so while I can talk about a lot of the images and idols and even more about the institutions, I want to just camp out on healthcare as being one of the institutions that was erected to serve those images and idols. Now, the view that Blackness was inherently unhealthy directly linked to the racializing of certain body types. The racializing of health happens when a person's race is seen as the primary factor that determines their health. It is a way to designate people to categories of health and wellness based on their race and not on medical evidence. For example, Black bodies have been deemed unhealthy regardless of their medical status. And this has allowed the medical field to assume that any medical issue that a Black person has is first a result of them being Black. Now, we've seen this most recently in the crisis of maternal mortality rates for Black women in our country. In the years preceding the Civil War, medical professionals in the South tried to build exclusive professional recognition in the medical field by distancing themselves from the medical practices of the North. And this effort to distance themselves from Northern medical training centers was linked to Southern laws that upheld slavery. Southern doctors claimed to have a unique set of medical circumstances based on their large population of Blacks, rooted in what is called the medical model of disability. The trouble, most of us know this, the trouble with the medical model of disability is that it insists that disability is a result of biomedical conditions that limit bodies and minds of those deemed disabled. In other words, the medical model of disability pathologizes individuals. So to pathologize a person or a group of people is to view them as abnormal. Their bodies, behaviors, and even beliefs are considered abnormal or disease, making it easier to see the whole person as medically unhealthy. They are seen according to conditions that make their bodies and minds abnormal or atypical. The pathologizing then of Blackness and disability in Western medicine and science has a historical connection to religious rhetoric that has influenced the moralizing of medical issues most often related to the Black community. There are, really I talk about in my research in my book, a lot of central figures, but there's three that I talk about, one of which is Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, the cereal, that family. And a lot of what he did was he created a system of determining health that was designed to ensure the survival of the white race once enslaved Africans were made free. And so his ideals were, we need to determine what it looks like for a healthy white woman. And to this day, a lot of those standards, including BMI and some of the other standards that we use to measure health, are still used in our healthcare system. But the problem is they were never designed for Black or disabled bodies. They were designed to ensure the survival of the white race. So this disability then has become a series of problems to be fixed or cured, thus placing the disabled at the mercy of the medical community. Now, this approach to disability and Blackness provided a needed platform for Southern physicians to pathologize Blackness and, in doing so, to assert their superior knowledge of medicine. The message that early Christian theology attached to disability and Blackness continued to be pervasive. Early Puritan theology paved the way for the fusing of morality with medical diagnosis and treatments in a manner that produced a healthcare system that had very little chance of operating without bias. So in other words, we see the influence of religion moralizing medical issues. And so a lot of times what we get is coded language like pre-existing conditions, coded language that moralizes that this certain group of people should have taken better care of themselves. And so medical issues, because of the church's influence on medicine, became moral issues. Now, I had my own experience with this last year, and I say in the beginning of my book that while I try to be objective as a scholar, I'm keenly aware that my experience shapes everything that I'm writing. But having dealt with battling stage 4 cancer, there's a lot of complications that come with that. And so in March of 2023, I was having some abdominal pain. Eventually, I went to the emergency room, the local emergency room. They sent me away, treating me as a drug seeker. Remember, when you're Black, being Black is your problem and why you're medically inferior. 4 days later, they didn't send me home with any pain medicine. 4 days later, the pain continued to increase. I went back to the same ER, this time calling the ambulance because I knew in transit, even though it was only 10 minutes from my house, they had to give me some drugs for the pain. And I got there and the doctor said, we're not doing another scan. We did one on a Monday. And they told me, you're just constipated, go home. Sent me home with enemas, of all things. Well, by Sunday of that week, this is almost a week later, the pain became so bad that I ended up, my wife said, let's go to where you're getting cancer treatment, which is about a 45-minute ride. And upon arriving to the emergency room at Emory University where I'm getting cancer treatment, the doctor did another scan and said, you have large bowel obstruction and you're about a couple of hours away from dying. The emergency room sent me away twice because, again, when you're Black or disabled, that in and of itself is your problem, and it's a moral issue. You should have taken better care of yourself. There's a story, I told you I'm a storyteller, of a kindergarten teacher who is walking around the room and she is watching all of her students doing art. She goes back to the back of the classroom and she notices a little girl who's drawing an interesting picture. She can't quite make it out. And so she asks Sarah, Sarah, what are you drawing? As I'm saying that, Sarah's sitting right here. Not that Sarah. And Sarah, without looking up or flinching, says, oh, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the kindergarten teacher just chuckles and says, oh, Sarah, nobody really knows what God looks like. And Sarah, without flinching, without looking up, says, they will when I'm done with this picture. So the question is, who gets to draw the pictures of what God looks like? Because let's be honest, all of our theology, no matter where you stand or what you believe, is just a vague attempt of trying to draw a picture of what God looks like. So dismantling this system, this hierarchy of bodies, these initial sin that we already addressed, the erection of images and idols of normalcy, oftentimes which equate to white, able-bodied maleness. The destruction of institutions, one of which being the church, but we focused this morning on healthcare. How do we dismantle this system, or how do we begin to dismantle this system? I propose that it means asking the questions, what is beauty? What is the relationship between beauty and faith? Who determines the eligibility for occupying this space we call beautiful? Who are the gatekeepers who guard the godly land of beauty, attractiveness, normalcy, and desirability? Who gets to draw the picture of God and say, this is what God looks like? Now, the politics of desire often begins with laying the weight of insecurity at the feet of those who often feel displaced in a culture that has deemed them ugly or undesirable. In other words, instead of dealing with our internalized ableism, we often shove the insecurity onto the people who we discriminate against. But what if we begin the discussion of desirability in a different place? The evangelical response to feelings of being ugly or undesirable is commonly the use of spiritual sleight of hand to actually affirm the ugliness of those questioning their beauty. This is typical of ableism, because ableism stands at the gate, or assumes to stand at the gate of beauty, and guards those who are deemed undesirable from gaining entry. But what if insecurity for being ugly or undesirable, or even being black in a country that doesn't celebrate blackness, is not a punishment, but a prophetic push against the unholy ableist practice of gatekeeping beauty and desire? Deshaun L. Harrison writes, insecurities are often taught as something to be afraid of, to be ashamed of, to run away from. People are taught that the way they feel about their bodies is their own moral failing, and therefore their responsibility to hold. We are all often socialized into believing that if we are insecure, then we are weak, incapable, or ugly, and that all of these are bad things to be. But Harrison believes that instead of scrutinizing individuals who are insecure about their beauty or their blackness or their bodies, that insecurity actually serves as a critique to a social system that punishes people for failing to live up to superficial standards, aka those idols or images that we've erected of what it means to be normal, what it means to be healthy, what it means to be beautiful, what it means to be desired. Now, the Christian faith arrived in the West as a means to an end. The reason it came, the route it took, and the associated residual effects all highlight that the Christian faith served the colonial agenda and white European colonists. Now, this is critical. The story of Jesus migrated to the Western world in the same capacity as an enslaved African did. I want you to sit with that for a second. I'm going to say that again so it can marinate like a good steak. The story of Jesus migrated to the Western world in the same capacity as an enslaved African did, as an indentured servant to white European colonists. From the outset, Christianity was hijacked as a resource for creating castes, more so than a religion that liberated marginalized people. In fact, the faith itself, I contend, is not fully free. It too was a slave sent to serve the masters who brought the religion across the waters of the Atlantic. And these masters shackled Christianity to a system of oppression from the beginning, failing to live out their faith in a way that was consonant with the teachings of the New Testament. The problem, one often not discussed as it relates to religion and race and disability, is that while enslaved Africans were eventually freed from their servitude to white America, the faith remained in chains. The people are now free, but the faith is not. So ableism and racism and all of the forms of marginalization remain entangled in our practice of Christianity today. We have yet to free the Christian faith from its service to the colonial agenda. So as I wrap up, I'll say this: we need another Emancipation Proclamation. This time, one that will free the story of Jesus, the God of justice, and free the power of the gospel from the chains of ableism and racism. Thank you. I guess we can take questions. Okay.
Hi, thank you for this absolutely brilliant talk. This was really, really wonderful, and I'm so glad that I picked up your book the other day. I'm very excited to read it. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to this relationship between, it seems to me there's sort of a conceptual disabling that takes place as well as a literal one in terms of like the white supremacist relationship to Black bodies. And so one part of that is what you were talking about, that Black people were deemed sort of inherently kind of intellectually inferior, and that was part of the justification for enslaving them. But then enslavement itself was physically disabling. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the relationship between that sort of I don't know if conceptual disabling is the right way to put it, but this idea that there's something inherent to Blackness that is disabling, but also the way that white supremacist systems operates does also physically disable bodies.
Yeah, I would probably say it exactly like that, right? I talk about it a little bit in the book. So a lot of it is initially conceptual, right? They had to, and this is why I say that just racial slavery and racism in America is not simply an issue of race. Because what I discovered, especially in a lot of documents, is that the way that they talked about African bodies, they tend to use language, maybe not language that we would use, but it always pointed back to this concept of them being disabled as a way of justifying what they were doing. And so, we all know that part of the definition of disability is one who is considered disabled, right? So there's that social component. And so very early on, in late 1600s, early 1700s, most of it was conceptual, right? But if you have a society and a culture being created that is deciding up front, we are going to place this label of disability on an entire group of people, then that entire group of people conceptually become disabled, whether or not they're actually disabled or not. We know very little about the health status of many of those people who came across, right? But racial slavery required something more than white people just looking at Black bodies and saying, we're better than you, right? There has to be a reason that they gave to say why they felt they were better. And so disability language is all throughout a lot of those early documents. And so it's conceptual. But then again, as we see slavery go on, and a great book that I used is The Mark of Slavery, where it talks about how the institution of slavery was disabling in that because it was brutal and torturous, you did see a lot of those who survived. A lot of enslaved Africans came out of that system with physical disabilities that they didn't have, but it was a result of the institution of slavery. And so I hate to say this, but it kind of became a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, right? They designated African bodies to disability in ways that they were never able to ascend out of. But then they started creating disabled bodies, so much so that a lot of the literature and research shows that part of the challenge, and I'm working on something about the Black church now as a follow-up to this book, but a lot of the reason why there continues to be a lot of mistrust, we know this, of the Black community of the healthcare system of that institution is not just Tuskegee. It was that the white slave masters, if they found that someone had a child who was born with a congenital disability, those children would be burned or drowned. And so a lot of disability within enslaved Africans in that community was hidden, right? And so there's some mistrust there. So you started to even see not just people who were given disabilities because of the torture, but a lot of the children were starting to be born into, just like any other population, right? But we don't have a whole lot of records about that because a lot of those children were hidden. They would say that the child didn't survive birth and certain things like that. And so you have an entire community that is trying to hide that from their white slave owners. Does that sort of help answer the question? Yeah.
Hi, this is Ben speaking over to your left, Lamar. Just so grateful for all the work you've done. There's a great disability activist named Imani Barbarin, also known as Crutches and Spice on social media.
Mm-hmm.
Recommend everybody follow. Great Black disability activist, and she talks about the idea that like all forms of oppression, their ultimate aim is to disable and or like do away with marginalized bodies, which I think speaks to this like the core of what your book and your work is about, is this intersectionality that like all of our liberation is bound up with one another. And I really appreciate your attentiveness to bodies and addressing the medical apartheid system. One of the things I've noticed in disability movements, especially in the disability rights movement, which was and continues to be particularly led by white cis hetero disabled folks. I'm curious, like I often find that a lot of people in the disability community, especially white people, are less interested in liberation, but more interested in reclaiming the privileges that have been lost as a result of disability.
Mm.
And there's an ultimate aspiration towards like that white able-bodiedness, and that's often the goal of like that movement, is to reassert white disabled people's power within society. And so I'm curious, what would be some guidance around maybe decentering that aspiration towards white able-bodiedness within disability activist spaces, or spaces that we're in just in general in the movement?
Mm. Yeah, use an important word that I use at the end of the book, where I talk about decentering faith. And I get it a little bit into, the buzzword of the last 10 years of deconstruction, right? And I talk about, in this movement, especially as we're talking about racism and ableism, advocating for more of a decentering, which is expanding. What I found is, especially with these movements, is I talk about in the book, I give an example of it being like musical chairs, right? The goal is to eliminate the seats and be the only one that has one. And that's a description of what you're saying. And so when I talk about decentering, it's more of an expansion project, looking at, even for this work, I quote Deshaun Harrison, which is a Black trans. And so I had to look at how other communities are wrestling with issues of the body, not just the disability community, right? And so there's a decentering of self, decentering even of my agenda, and expanding the conversation to include other communities. And I even advocate for, having even a closer relationship with science, right? To look at how, when we decenter ourselves, because the design conversations, you talk about a lot of white people in the disability movement are sort of aspiring to ascend, even though that's not explicitly said, right? He's trying to aspire to ascend to the privileges that white male able-bodiedness has, right? A large part of that discussion, you also have to talk about the design issue, which is a big issue in disability, right? Which is why we have those images and idols, because a lot of people will contend, well, God has a design for the human body and it looks like this. And then disabled people will say, well, if people who have that design get these privileges, I want those too, right? So I want to ascend to that. Even if I can't do it bodily, I want the privileges that come along with that perceived design. And then so when I say decentering, I talk about even having that conversation, looking at science and nature and looking at things like, we can't really have that conversation about design without looking at the rest of creation, right? And I think that helps decenter that a little bit and helps to curb that aspiration, because I'm not looking at just humanity being the sole reflection of God's creative genius, right? It's decentering and saying God created a lot of things. God created a bunch of birds that have wings that don't fly. And the other birds are not making fun of them, right? And calling them disabled, right? So I think part of it is decentering ourselves even as a part of God's creation. And that sort of helps erode that aspiration of trying to ascend to the privileges that these images and idols seem to enjoy, right? Because now I don't believe, even as a human, that I'm the sole reflection of God's creative genius. As a matter of fact, we were created last, right? Everything, even in the environment, is an accommodation if you think about it. We need gravity as an accommodation so we can be mobile, right? So for me, that helped me to decenter myself within the disability community, look at other communities that are talking about issues of body. I don't always understand it, but they give me great insight, right? It's decentering. Again, who gets to draw the picture of what God looks like? I need more people. I don't need musical chairs. I don't want to be the only one sitting in the chair saying, I have the picture. I want more pictures, more images, more people who are drawing pictures of God to help me decenter. And it helps to erode that need for trying to ascend to these unholy images that we create of what it means to be normal and the perceived privileges that they receive. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Iris. I don't have a question. I actually want to thank you because it was an aha moment when you told the story about this girl that drew the picture of God. I don't know why, but immediately I remembered the story from Exodus when Moses is married the other women, and Miriam and Aaron are talking about her. And what's happened? God is coming and banned Miriam from everyone and exclude her from everyone. And now I understand, this is my interpretation, that who can say this person need to be like this or this person need to be like that, right? And so thank you so much. It makes me to think in a broad in a broad view now on this story and to understand much more about it. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good morning. So I wanted to ask about, you referenced the evangelical faith. So in reference to the evangelical faith and their pursuit of perfection, how do you put that in conversation with what is perceived as Blackness and brokenness? And even going so far as to say the privilege of self-diagnoses that we currently live in now. How do you put that in conversation With evangelical Christian, perfection is the pursuit, but you are inherently Black and broken. I put that in quotes, but you're also now have a particular demographic that has the privilege of diagnosing themselves. You went to the hospital with what sounds like level 10 pain, and it doesn't sound like you were even a conversation partner in your own diagnoses. But there's a group that can now diagnose themselves. And how does that, your opinion on that?
Complicated. Let me ask you, the group that's diagnosing themselves is, what is that group that you're referring to?
So there are now some invisible disabilities that groups are now able to diagnose themselves with, whether it be ADHD, OCD, autism, and they are weighted as valid diagnoses. While there are I've worked with families who have medical diagnoses from a professional, and the school board still throws it out without wanting to accommodate them or give them IEPs. But then I am now learning that there are groups who can say, I have this, and it is accepted. And yeah.
So I'm just going to say, when you say groups, you're talking about white people?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just, let's just break it down so I'm clear. That is a super complicated question. I think what we're experiencing is still the residue of that privilege that even within quote unquote marginalized circles like disability, there's still an extreme level of privilege to be able to name and define. And even when I talk about idols and images, what I found, and this question was also brilliant, what I found in disability circles, especially when it comes to white disabled people, is that even though they're in this category and they're disabled and that's still a marginalized group, the residue of the power and privilege still seeps into even that community. And so they are allowed and afforded the privilege of being able to name something and to diagnose themselves and for that to be validated. One of the things that I talk about, and this refers to that, is that ableism isn't just about bodies. I talk about this in the work. It's also about bodies of work. And I said this earlier, it's about the right bodies being able to have the right thoughts, right? And so for Black disabled bodies, we're still not the right bodies. So anything that we come up with, whether it's theological diagnosis, any kind of theories, this is why a lot of the bodies of work of Black people are not taken seriously. But that's also the residue of ableism. And so what I see is that there's still that afforded privilege even within that class of marginalized people that is still not afforded to Black and brown bodies. And I'll even say women as well, right? That's why you have the maternal mortality rate. Two of the most famous women that died for that actually debunked the entire reason why medical professionals were saying Black women were dying, which is that they were uneducated and, all the rhetoric, right? Well, two of the women I talk about in the book, one was an MD and one was a PhD who was studying maternal mortality rates. And neither one of them had their medical needs taken care of because they weren't taken seriously, right? And so I think that's still part of this justice movement. It's one of the reasons why I'm also working on some things about the historically Black church and enslaved Africans and the way that they saw health. And it was more communal. And I'm hoping to write a book about that so that we can take some of the things that we learned from the historically Black church, which led the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement led to disability rights. But there seems to be a disconnection there. And I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from the historically Black church that will help us address some of those issues. One of which, Dr. King and so many others were masters at helping create images that change the perception of Blackness and Black bodies, right? The way that they marched. We talked about singing earlier. Those types of things help to reframe the images of Blackness for America, and even showing some of the images of what was being done to disable Black bodies. And that garnered support from the North, right? But they were masters at reframing those images and idols that I talked about. They're very disruptive to those. And I think that's what we need, is to continue that justice work of being able to disrupt those images, because the reason why a lot of people in the disability community that don't look like us are reaching for what we talked about earlier, those perceived privileges, is because those images and idols of what it means to be normal come with lots of benefits, right? But we still don't get that, because whatever comes from Black bodies is still deemed deficient. So it's not just that Black bodies are disabled. The bodies of work that come from Black and brown bodies are also deemed deficient. But we got to work to change that. Does that help answer the? Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hardwick. I'm here. I want to thank you for your research, for your ministry, and also your advocacy. As an Asian Indonesian doing theology of disability, I was very much looking for your books, and when I know it's published, I have it and I read it, and I'm so grateful for it. So thank you so much. And when you mention colonialism as one of the root of ableism and racism, I think I can relate so much because as Indonesian, we have been colonized by Dutch for many years, and the colonialism project came hand in hand with eugenic project.
Mm-hmm.
So there is one eugenic center in one location in Indonesian island, and when they have this center, they measure Indonesian native body because we are considered shorter than the Dutch, and they measure all the blood and the skin and intellectually based on their own standard. And I think this is very much related to Asian bodies living with disability. And here, as an international student, I live with immigrant communities in the US. And I think this colonial experience also still perpetuated within the immigrant communities in the US because most of Indonesian immigrant, for example, we do not have fluency in English, and we are considered intellectually inferior because of that. And not only that, we have different culture. For example, the food that we have considered stinky, and it's very much making some Indonesian immigrant feeling like they have inferiority. So I wonder whether you have found this experience related to your project, because this problem not only showing the good example of how ableism intertwine with racism, but also how this give big implication to internalized racism and ableism for immigrant community in the US. That's one. And the other one, I am curious about the book that you wrote. Doing this research, I wonder if you found any literature in the current theology of disability discourse helpful or unhelpful? Thank you so much.
Good question. To answer the first question, I would say, I'm very particular to say in the West, because that's where I focus a lot of my energy and my research. But then also I focus primarily on the experience of Blacks in America. But I will say this is that the colonial agenda, wherever it surfaces, requires the use of ableism as an active practice to support its economic goals, right? So you'll see that in other countries, although I didn't study that as much, and I didn't talk about it in the book, you'll see it everywhere. It starts popping up everywhere. So when you talk about even immigrant communities, a lot of that does turn into internalized ableism. Some of that, quite honestly, is even a part of the challenges of African-American communities, right? Internalized ableism. I talk about it a little bit in the book. I have a chapter on the Black church, and at the end of it, I talk about how even the Black church still has work to do when it comes to disability and understanding that, because there's a lot of internalized ableism and racism. And that's because whenever a country or area is colonized, everyone is now swimming in that, even if they realize it or not. And so it's very, very challenging to resist that internalized ableism and racism, because it's a part of the colonial agenda, and you'll see it everywhere. And so it's not just, and then I think I said it in the talk, is that we're all victims of that, right? And we're swimming in this ethos. We're swimming in being constantly bombarded with these images and idols of what it means to be normal. And for many of us, those images and idols don't look like us at all. And so, but also someone talked about the big perspective is also what I was trying to do in the book, is make ableism, take that and expand our idea of what it is and what it does, right? So even you talk about the foods and all that, ableism is at the root of all of that, because it decides, and I said this in the beginning, it decides what's normal, where bodies belong, which bodies get to say, which bodies get to draw pictures of God, which bodies get to determine what food is right? And so it's a huge issue, but I think in answering to your second question, what's not been helpful in disability literature is I found that using the terms ableism is very narrow, and oftentimes it doesn't help address like the issues of racism that are connected to it, the issues of gender identity that are connected to it, right? And some of that is also because even that term and understanding disability is still swimming in the colonial agenda, right? And so what surfaces to the top, even when you're trying to define that, is the ideal image of what it means to be a body. You talked about ascending to that. And so even the term ableism, to be honest with you, is bathed in whiteness, not the color, but the concept of what it means to be white, right? And I found that not to be helpful because it doesn't address my social location, or it doesn't help address even things like the models of disability. I found sometimes not to be helpful because it doesn't address various social locations, right? A lot of times it only, and even those terms, if you think about it, I believe it was started by a white man, right? And so that's not to discredit his work, but he's obviously, as I said in my book, I'm in the beginning, I know that what I'm saying here is coming out of my social location and my experience. So I want to acknowledge that, right? But ableism doesn't acknowledge that at all, because it thinks that its experience is the default experience for all bodies. So in the same way that I have to acknowledge, like, I'm a African-American male who's autistic, also has cancer, has other physical disabilities because of the cancer. Everything that I'm about to say comes from that social location. Ableism, and when it's tied to colonial agenda, doesn't have to make that declaration, because it just assumes that its experience is a default experience. So a lot of the literature that's currently out isn't helpful for that reason, because it refuses to acknowledge that it's coming from a particular social location. And I'm okay with that. Being white is not a sin. But we have to recognize the residue of the concept that was created, and how everything that we are doing is swimming in that, whether we realize it or not.
I want a question and a comment, and then I'll pass it on to you, Tisha. To you. Comment about the social location, and that's not always the same. This is just more of a comment and a personal story. As a white guy who grew up in a black world in Nigeria, and there, it was still, in many places, I was a curiosity as a kid when we would go to some villages and others, because obviously I looked different, and I was very different in terms of that social location. And the word for me as a white person was defined out of that context was Oyibo. And Oyibo literally meant peeled one. That I was a black person who had been peeled because we were all pink underneath. And it just was, it's one of those things, lessons over and over again about how our social location defines what we think kind of as difference, and so on. My question to you is, what's the in all this mix? And thank you for the talk, which I think is brilliant and will be one of our Institute highlights for a long time. What about the paradox of white people's, and maybe others, fear of the power of the black person and of the black body? I mean, it's like, we're fascinated with the black NFL athletes and the basketball players and others. But even in slavery here in this country, there was this, there was so much force used against slaves because they were terrified that somebody was going to rise up and challenge the whole system. Have you done a reflection about the paradox about we do all this putting down, but there's this paradox of the fear, and is all the put down to deal with the fear or whatever? I'm just curious how you struggle with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't spend a lot of time with that, but I've read some people who have talked about that, and so obviously where that fear is present is an indication of this idea that what if these people actually do to us what we're doing to them, right? But I also say, I think even beyond that, which is a great conversation, and as we talk about that relationship, is this, when you brought up NFL, is this idea of being able to, because of fear, extract all of the, which is I talked about, the reason why ableism is attached to racial slavery, because it's the business of bodies, right? But attached to that, I think, to that fear is also this need to extract and to, what's the word I'm looking for? Find a ways to profit off of. Monetize, thank you. That's what I'm looking for, right? And I think that's also part of that fear, right? Is to be able to extract and monetize. And that was part of the colonial and capitalist agenda, right? So that part of being able to kind of help soothe that fear is to be able to have the economic power to be able to throw it off any sort of uprising, any sort of reversal of fortunes, right? Which is why you see so many, and we know this because we're all great historians, that's why you see so many laws and statutes and ordinances created post-slavery to keep enslaved Africans economically disadvantaged, right? Because part of dealing with that fear is to be able to maintain and sustain economic power. And some of that, a large part of that is, even as you talk about the NFL and I reflect, is being able to extract and monetize the worth of the black body, right? And so it didn't even stop with slavery, right? There's ways that our culture is appropriated and monetized in ways that continue to help thwart off that fear of what, because if you have it's like they say in every movie, follow the money, right? If you have the economic power, it doesn't matter what the numbers are. And I think part of that too is the conversation we need to have about that fear. It's not just of physical violence, but of we talked about the privileges that came along with this creation of because remember, whiteness was a creation, right? Before that, you were wherever you came from, Irish, you were, right? So this creation of whiteness came with a lot of privileges that in order to sort of hold that off, you need the economic power to do so. So it started with slavery, right? The exploitation of Black bodies. Now we see it in other ways with the appropriation of Black culture in ways that can be monetized. Like the primary listeners of a lot of I'm just going to say this, the rap music, a lot of stuff I don't even listen to anymore. The primary listeners of that are not Black people. It's marketed, right? But there's so much money that's being made that's not going to the Black community because of that. And there's other ways that Black culture has been appropriated. So you still have the same ethos, right? Because of that fear, we're gonna find a way to extract and monetize what the Black body does well and be able to use that as a way of dealing with that fear, as long so that we can continue the economic power that we have, if that sort of makes sense. But that's something I would like to consider and think about further.
So thanks so much. And I am now going to pick up your book. I have not read it yet. And I'm excited about the book you or may be in the process of writing. Thinking about this, my context was first in the Black church. And as a person with a disability, experiencing ableism in that space. So moving toward white spaces because I was able to gain some access in terms of because there has been more work around disability rights, right? But in white spaces, I'm still Black and a woman. So strategies around or thoughts around coming back into the Black space, because I know there's work to be done there and wanting to do that. And just dealing with also being exhausted with having to like show up in both white and Black spaces, depending on what, as like a woman, a Black person, and a person with a disability. It just makes me want to go to sleep.
We talked about internalized ableism and internalized racism, a lot of internalized ableism, which is why I dealt with that. I have a chapter in the book called Blackballed, and I talk about how the Black church is not the invention of Black people. It is the result of discrimination, right? Y'all don't want us here, so we're going to do our own thing. But with that, again, swimming in a lot of internalized ableism. Some of that is because of what I said earlier, having to hide disability from slave masters and then eventually the white community, because it was something that was doubly frowned upon if you're a person of color. Then experiments like Tuskegee and all these other things, that there's a lot of internalized ableism that we're still dealing with in the church. And so I'll say the first way that I have been trying to do it, because I grew up in the Black church. My father's a pastor, and I don't ever remember us talking about disability. The closest that we got is we had a sick and shut-in list for those who grew up and even some white churches, right? Just sick and shut-in list is basically, the back of the bulletin. These are all the people who are too ill or disabled to come to church, right? Pray for them. That was the extent of our disability ministry. But I do realize now I'm more appreciative of the residue in the history of why it became necessary for the Black church and there's a lot of, and I talk about it in the book, there's a lot of services and advocacy and things that are going on, but it's not public. And a lot of that residue has to do with it wasn't safe, right? So I'm trying to work on that. Part of writing the book was my attempt at that, is helping, because I wrote Disability in the Church and it was broader, but I'm just going to say this: Black people didn't buy that book, to be honest with you. So one of my goals was to try to help the Black church, which has a rich history and connection to activism, right, especially the civil rights movement, to see ableism as a justice issue. So saying how ableism fuels racism was my way of saying, okay, I now kind of given you a precursor in disability in your church, and this is just kind of sneak peek. These two books are conceptually, in my vision, a part of a trilogy. The next one's going to be specifically about the Black church and aimed at the Black church. But the bridge is to help the Black church to first say, this is a justice issue. It is deeply connected to our social location and our history, ableism, and see it as such, see it as a justice issue and pique the interest. And, to be honest, I've gotten far more response from minority communities with this book than with the last book. And that was the intention, is to say, these things are connected, so we have to talk about it, we have to make it public. The next one is gonna go deeply into what you're talking about, like the issues of, and I say it in the book, I'm gonna write more about this later. I say that in this current book, because it is an issue. I don't have all the answers. I'm coming to appreciate why there's a lot of that in there, because in my research, I found out that there were horrific things done to disabled Black people, disabled Black children, because they weren't able to monetize them if their bodies were not those that they could put to work. And so there's horrific stories of drownings and burning kids. And so there's a residue there that we got to get over. The reason why we made it something that was not public, or something that was not, seems like it's not a lot of attention, because it just wasn't safe. And hopefully I can help address that and help us to navigate that a little bit better with this next work.
Lamar, thank you so much for such a profound and fabulous presentation.
Thank you.